All right, hello and good afternoon. For anyone who forgot, because we've been practicing proper social distancing procedures here at Sacramento State, my name is José Miranda Campbell. My pronouns are he, his, and him, and I am a writing tutor and senior workshop leader at the Peer and Academic Resource Center. Today's lecture or workshop attempt is about paragraph structure, and this is the third in a series and a culmination of videos that's really aiming to help specifically this upper division history course in crafting our second essay. So without further ado, general purpose of a paragraph. Now this seems super simple, but I think it's important to cover. So every piece of academic writing is structured by paragraphs and headings. Believe it or not, there was a point in time where there was no systematic way of separating out our writing. So that's why sometimes some of the older writing is really hard to kind of decipher through because they didn't follow the conventions we do today. In general, your paragraphs should be unified. Within the paragraph itself, the whole paragraph should be unified. All sentences should relate to one central point or idea. The paragraph itself should be coherent. Sentences should be logically organized and clearly connected to one another and to your topic. And of course, the paragraph itself should be relevant to what you're talking about. Sometimes it's really tempting to throw in something that is maybe loosely related or it reminds you of something else, but we have to resist that urge and make sure that what we're putting into our essay is relevant to the topic that we're discussing in a given project. So to walk you through the process of writing strong paragraphs, we'll use an example from an essay that I actually wrote last semester in my senior writing seminar. That I hope, we're not going to cover much of it, only a couple paragraphs, but I really enjoyed writing it. It was a semester-long endeavor, and it was really fun for me. So as per usual, we're going to start by looking at the anatomy of a paragraph. Some of us are a little bit more scientifically inclined. Well, this time I don't have a formula, but we'll look at it at the anatomy side of things. So the topic sentence, right? Our last workshop was all about topic sentences and the importance of them. One of the things to keep in mind always when writing is a topic sentence is the beginning. It should state one idea clearly. There are some times where you can, bend the rules a little bit and talk about more than one thing, but that's going to be the exception, not the rule. You should generally aim to have one idea stated within your topic sentence. And a useful tip, always put the most important information first. Because your paragraphs have to be succinct, it's important that the most important information comes up before everything else. You have room for fluff in other parts of the essay and sometimes in other parts of the same paragraph. Now your supporting sentences, right? This is the meat and cheese of that paragraph hamburger. This is the middle. This is what's going to help you or is going to allow you to elaborate, explain on the ideas that you've introduced through your topic sentence. And this is where your evidence is going to come up. The examples that you've found through either research or reading or what have you, depending on the type of essay you're writing. In a essay like the one we're working on, it's a little bit of an argumentative essay where we're presenting a point and defending it. We're gonna have specific examples that we're then going to elaborate on to make our point. And of course, each sentence should have a concluding end. And your concluding sentence should make links. Now, when looking at how these links are made, there's really three choices. The link can be made to the topic sentence of the given paragraph. That's to say, it can work as a restatement of your topic sentence, although because these paragraphs are relatively shorter than in long works, and you don't have a lot of room, sometimes that can be a little repetitive. So I wanted to say it first because it's sometimes the hardest way to really do a concluding sentence is to have it echo your beginning, but there has to be, that sometimes is an option depending on stylistic choices. The second option, of course, is that the concluding sentence can somehow link back to your thesis itself, right? In this upcoming essay, we're arguing that Sledge's personal account of his experiences in the Pacific Theater complicate that idea of a good war. Therefore, it's not wrong, and in fact, encouraged that at least a few times throughout this 4 to 5 page essay, you'll be echoing back to your primary thesis, which is that his idea is complicated, the idea of a good war. So that concluding sentence can sometimes harken back. Sometimes it could be as simple as reason X, whatever evidence you presented in this paragraph, demonstrates how the good war was complicated or further complicated by Sledge's experiences. And lastly, and this is my favorite way to do it, is that your concluding sentence in a paragraph can foreshadow, can tease, can link to the next paragraph, the very next one. And in fact, the example that we'll be looking at today, that's how I work that part of it. So before we move forward, I'm going to check the chat. Does anybody have any questions so far? I guess that kind of nulls the point of a private chat with the fact that I'm sharing the screen. So keep that in mind right now, because I have to do the share screen. A private message won't be entirely private right now. Okay. So, oops, what did I do? Did I get, no, we're good, we're good. Aha. Okay, so after the anatomy, a little bit more of the process. Now in this one, it's gonna feel like a lot of information. I'm just gonna lay it out and then we're gonna go by it step by step together. So step one, this is a 5-step process of figuring out the general construction, kind of the scaffolding of your paragraph. And the step one, of course, is to figure out what the heck is going to be going on in this paragraph. Identify the paragraph's purpose. Step two, show why this paragraph is relevant. Often, we feel that with our topic sentence, we can then just kind of go in which direction. We have to continue to reinforce the point we're making and to show why this paragraph in particular is relevant. Then we have to provide evidence, right? We can't just say, this is important because I said so. Because those of us, at least myself included in this workshop, we don't have PhDs yet. And even when we do, even more so, we have to prove that what we're saying isn't just because we felt like it. And step four, explain or interpret the evidence. This is where our voice comes through, right? Often, for those of you that I've had the pleasure of working with all semester, that's one of the things I constantly say is, hey, where's your voice? I don't see your voice in here. And sometimes that can be confusing for undergrad students who say, well, we're undergrad students. Well, we don't write this stuff. We're not professional historians yet. But there is some room for us to be able to inject our voice and inject our opinion based in fact on what we're reading and what we're writing about. So this is where there's that room for that. And of course, the fifth and final step, sort of, there's more steps, but for the purposes of this slide, for the fifth step, you then conclude the paragraph. You have to finish it up. So we identify, we show why it's relevant, we provide evidence, we explain our evidence, and then we conclude the paragraph. In this kind of formulaic approach, right, I try to simplify it as much as possible because particularly with such a, in a fun way, for me at least, difficult question for this essay too, sometimes it can help to just really break things down into its most basic components so that we can move forward. Any questions on process of paragraph construction so far? I'm going to pull up the chat again. And as always, I'm sorry, I don't think I mentioned it this time. You can either type in the chat or you can just jump in and voice. There's no set etiquette here. Interrupt me at any time because all I hear on my side is myself talk. All right, we shall move forward. Oh, I did put the step 6 here. Shame on me. That's okay. Read through the whole paragraph. And that sounds silly. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on that in just a minute. But the 5 primary steps are what's I meant to remove that from this slide. Okay, so at step 1, we're going to identify the purpose. First, you need to know what the central idea is that will organize this paragraph. As I said in the last workshop, in a little bit more detail, our topic sentence not only provides us, the writer of a roadmap. Oh, it looks like we have someone coming in. I'm going to let them in. Hello, new participant. We are recording, just so you are fully aware. And you haven't missed too much so far, so welcome. And we're actually right at step 1. You missed a little bit of the preamble, but that's okay. In step 1, like I said, first, you need to know the central idea that will organize this paragraph. And the paragraphs, I'm sorry, the topic sentences, right, which is where we mostly identify this, like I said in the last workshop, provides us, the writers, with a roadmap, but also the readers. They know exactly what's going to happen, what to expect in one form or another. And so, pro tip, if you already have an outline created, which should be, the initial pre-writing stage of essay creation, if you already have an outline, this step is often already done. You already know what you want to put in what paragraph. You just might have to short up, new ideas, or might get reshaped as the rest of it. So, okay, so here's an example from one of my essays. This was my topic sentence. Juanita's identity is a historical enigma.
Knock the door.
And if you wouldn't mind
door.
muting yourselves,
Sabe.
so you have a question for me. Okay. All right, so this is my example, like I said, on the topic sentence on one of my paragraphs in the paper that I produced for my upper division senior writing seminar. Juanita's identity is a historical enigma. Now, oops, let's go back. Can anyone tell me, or anyone like to chime in, what they think is wrong with this topic sentence? Because there is room to argue that there's something wrong with this sentence. I promise I won't take it personally. So,
is it too broad?
A little bit. I definitely bend, if not kind of break the rules, my own rules, right? Well, not my own rules. I didn't invent the rules of writing, but the rules I've been talking to you guys about for a couple of weeks now. Yeah, it's a little too broad. And in the paper that I wrote, it was a long paper, so there's a little bit more room to kind of bend those rules, which is why I kind of get away with it in that format. But for our purposes in essay 2, that would be way too broad, right? If we said something like Sledge had a bad time in the Pacific Theater, well, it's like, well, yeah. Now, where I'm going to give you a little bit more context on my sentence here, as we move forward, it'll make sense why it works and why I kind of get away with it. But in general, a sentence like this is actually bad. I would, if I just saw the sentence with no context and someone told me, hey, this is my topic sentence, I would say exactly what you said, Keely. This is way too broad. What are you talking about? So excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it breaks the rules. So now that said, right, if you began a reading and the first sentence you read was Juanita's identity is a historical enigma, you would at least know, well, we're talking about Juanita's identity, whoever Juanita is, right? Because you have none of the background that preceded this by like 5 or 6 pages. I claim that there's something important in her name and identity alone. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward, and that'll help you give a little bit of background to the rest of my examples as I bring them up. So now this is a sentence right before that paragraph. It's actually 2 sentences, but Juanita, well aware of her predicament as one of the few women in Downeyville, was beautiful in countenance, and such details about her beauty were consistent through most descriptions of her, both by her contemporaries and secondhand accounts found after the fact. What was not consistent, however, was her name. And then I, hit enter, tab. Juanita's identity is a historical enigma. So you see, it flowed into itself a little more. And then at the end, once we go through all the steps, I'm going to show you what it looked like going from one paragraph to another and then to a third paragraph and how that flow kind of went. So for now, so that you don't think, oh, Jose tells us topic sentence rules and then he breaks them. I do a little bit, but it'll make sense. So step 1, identifying the purpose, right? There's a whole thing of this. Someone reading the sentence, Juanita's identity is a historical enigma, knows that we're talking about her identity, if nothing else, even if it is broad. Now in step 2, we have to demonstrate the relevance. Now this is a little difficult it was difficult for me to figure out how to put into words, but this is where we have to this is sometimes where background information comes in. This is sometimes where relevance of the topic comes in and our voice on it. So the topic sentence tells the reader what the paragraph is about, but then we have to tell them why this matters, why it's important to our overall argument. The so what, we hear that in history a lot, the so what, so Sledge went to the Pacific Theater and witnessed some terrible things. So what? Well, so what in our case for essay 2 is that his experiences complicate the idea of a good war, and that we then need to explain to the reader how these experiences changed fundamentally. In one argument, if I were writing it, I would argue that it changed who he was as a person, and therefore the view of a good war. So an example for how I demonstrate the relevance, right, with that previous example, there are varying accounts that suggest that Juanita was more than likely not her actual name. And here now I'm demonstrating more and more. So her identity was a historical enigma, and now I'm saying there's several different accounts of the same person, of 100% historically the same person, who some people call her one thing and some people call her Juanita. So there's some mystery there that I worked through my paper to resolve. Yeah, so let me see, check my notes. So yeah, one more thing to add on relevance on that, usually that second or third line, depending on how your topic sentence went. The time that you spend in your paragraph to demonstrate the relevance, you're expanding on a topic, and you're showing to the reader how what you're arguing fits into that topic. All right, so now we have to provide the evidence, right? Some sort of evidence. So my example for this paragraph, that it'll be easier once I have it all on one screen for you, but as author Matthew Rojas indicates in her article, this doesn't come out right because I put it all in italics. Okay, the article's name is Remembering Josefa, Reading the Mexican Female Body in California Gold Rush. Juanita's name was actually Josefa. And then the funky 15 there was my footnote, so ignore that. But so my evidence is that the author Matthew Rojas, in her article Remembering Josefa, demonstrates in historically gathered original documents together to prove that Juanita's name was actually Josefa, and it got changed later on. And so as we move through our paragraph, right, we're building up this house. We have this topic sentence. We've told the reader why what we're saying matters, and now we're providing some evidence that's building on itself, right? Oh, there's a footnote that copied over weird. Okay, now we need to explain and interpret the evidence. Once again, this is where our voice can come in, because we need to be able to do more than just copy paste a quote. This is where sometimes this can take the shape of more evidence, but before we get into that, this is where you're going to explain that evidence. So one of the examples in Sledge's book are the atrocities he witnessed in combat, right? We won't get into the details here today, but we would present in step 3, we'd have presented some sort of proof of the evidence, some example of it. And then in step 4, we would have argued why or how that evidence complicates the idea of a good war. And so in general, when we're writing our paragraphs at this 4th step, sometimes it can be 1 or 2 sentences, sometimes more. It really depends on it depends on a lot of things. It depends on how complex a piece of evidence was, how complex your topic is. But in general, this is a 4th step. Don't necessarily think of these steps as 1 sentence each. They can be sometimes more, right? It really depends on our own personal style. I know I can be very wordy not only when I speak, but when I write. So once again, this is your opportunity to inject your voice into the argument. By this point in the paragraph, you have stated what you're talking about, why it matters, and cited some form of proof for your stance. Now, just elaborate. So my elaboration is Josefa's designation morphed over time for reasons that are representative of the experiences of women of color during the California Gold Rush. Rojas gathers that in order for a society that held women in such high esteem, the Mexican that Josefa represented in her had to be punished. So the background here, real quick, is Josefa was this young woman in Downeyville, California, just a few miles north from where we are in Sacramento, at least where I am in Sacramento. Not a few miles, more than a few miles, but anyway, relatively close, who was, by recorded California history, the only woman hung ever by a lynch mob. Not a lunch mob. That would have been maybe nice, a lunch mob, but a lynch mob hung this woman. She was attacked by an Anglo man, and she, in self-defense, killed him. There's some dispute as to how everything went down, and I go in depth into that into my paper. Some accounts say that she attacked him viciously. Some accounts say that she defended himself. I definitely based on evidence, agree with the fact that she defended herself. She understood the circumstance she was in as one of the few women in this town, in this gold rush town, and killed a man. And now, but the point of it all in that paper is that justice was not what was being served that day. The mob, angered that one of their own had been killed by some other, infuriated them to the point that they hung her that same day the murder was committed. She did not get due justice. She did not get due process. And I serve in my paper several other examples of other women of varying different kinds of social background who committed a same or worse act and got justice. And Josefa, simply for being a woman and for being a woman of color, was hung. And so, anyway, sorry, I get distracted. I love this topic. This is definitely where I steer towards. So to give you a little background on this. So the Mexican, right, in kind of a bad connotation in that time, Josefa had to be punished. And so her name was then changed. And the reason for that I go into in my paper, but the reasons for that is because Josefa was actually extremely beloved in that town. A lot of people liked her. She worked there. She wasn't, a woman of the night or anything like that. She had a very high esteem in the town. But when she killed somebody, all records of her suddenly changed. Suddenly she's evil. Suddenly she's dirty. She's all these nasty things. And they changed her name because it was easier to kind of create this new thing, this new person, instead of remembering the woman that they knew. So anyway, so step 3 and 4 again. Now, what I mean by this, step 3 and 4 can sometimes in a paragraph happen. Well, in a paragraph, it shouldn't happen probably more than twice at the most. And if we look back right at step 3 and 4 again is when we're providing evidence and elaborating on it. So sometimes for a given topic sentence, we're going to have more than one piece of evidence, right? Particularly, let's say in Sledge's work, we're talking about the brutality of war. I'm pretty sure there's at least 2 examples of grossness in war, right? At least 2. So, and all of us are going to approach it in a very different way. And so steps 3 and 4 can happen several times. I would argue no more than twice in a given paragraph. So far, does anybody have any questions? I know I went almost breathlessly there for a couple minutes. I'm going to pull up the chat. Like I said before, feel free to either post in the chat or chime in through voice. Okay, so in my example in this paragraph, I actually do utilize step 3 and 4 again. So my step 3 evidence for the second time is only after order is restored through the punishment of a Mexican for killing of a Euro-American can Josefa's gender be acknowledged. In my elaboration, beauty and violence cannot be amalgamated into one being. Future references to Josefa reported her name differently in an attempt to reconcile the contesting images caused by Josefa's actions. Once again, my footnotes are all funky on this, so ignore those. But we see here, I once again present some evidence, present some elaboration on that evidence. And so step 5, actually, let me take a second to look at my notes, make sure I'm not accidentally skipping something. Oh yeah, this is important for evidence. Of course, we want to make sure we always cite things properly. In our rough drafts, it's fine to do whichever way comes naturally to us. At this point, I've written in history enough that footnotes are what come naturally to me. But I understand most of us were trained either in MLA or APA, so by the time we get to this level of writing, we're not. That's what's kind of ingrained in us. But be sure to cite properly as you go. And when you're citing things like statistics, it's good to be able to elaborate on why those statistics are important. I've read a lot of papers, not in this class, but in others, where students will just throw a bunch of numbers and it's hard for the reader to decipher what the true meanings of those numbers are, right? We can look at 70% of blah, blah, blah and understand that that's a huge margin of that group of whatever people or whatever we're studying. But it's important to elaborate. Don't just throw numbers, elaborate why the given statistic is important. Okay, so finally, you want to wrap up the paragraph by returning to your main point and demonstrating the overall consequences of the evidence you have explored. particularly in something like Sledge's work, we're looking at this, depending on your approach, this incremental growth of loss of maybe pride, or loss of belief and honor in our country. Depending on how you approach it, could be a lot of different ways, but you want to make a call back to that, to demonstrate to the reader that you know what you're saying, and that you strongly, through facts, believe what you're stating, and that this is how this particular group of facts, if it's more than one or two pieces of evidence that you elaborated on, harken back to your actual thesis. All right. And so an example for my concluding sentence in that paragraph: on the one hand, a beautiful Spanish woman was hanged in a manner they knew was unjust. On the other hand, the same person committed murder. Self-defense or not, the mob demanded justice. So what I want to show you here is how it all looks when I put it together. I think that'll give you a better idea at what my overall point is here. I know we're screen sharing, but it might be a little hard to see. Control plus, no. Yeah, there we go. Can everybody see this okay? I guess I'll take non-complaints as yes, we can see it okay. So, all right, so all together, this is not the top and bottom parts are not the full paragraphs before and after the main paragraph. They're just the last sentence or two. So Juanita, well aware of her predicament as one of the few women in Downeyville, was beautiful in countenance, and such details about her beauty were consistent throughout most descriptions of her, both by her contemporaries and secondhand accounts found after the fact. What was not consistent, however, was her name. Juanita's identity is a historical enigma. There are varying accounts that suggest Juanita was more than likely not her actual name. As author Matthew Rojas indicates in her article, Remembering Josefa, Reading the Mexican Female Body in California Gold Rush, Juanita's actual name was Josefa. Josefa's designation morphed over time for reasons that are representative of the experiences of women of color during the California Gold Rush. Rojas gathers that in order for a society that held women in such high esteem, the Mexican that Josefa represented in her had to be punished. Only after order is restored through the punishment of a Mexican for killing a Euro-American can Josefa's gender be acknowledged. Beauty and violence could not be amalgamated into one being. Further references to Josefa reported her name differently in an attempt to reconcile the contesting images caused by Josefa's actions. On the one hand, a beautiful Spanish woman was hanged in a manner they knew was unjust. On the other hand, the same person committed murder, self-defense or not, and the mob demanded justice. Therefore, when Josefa died at the makeshift gallows erected by the lynch mob, Juanita was born to die in her stead. As Rojas stated in her 2007 article, recalling the details of Josefa's hanging, these accounts gave way to promoting Juanita, a simulacrum of Josefa that further dismembers the imagined body of the only woman ever hanged in the state of California. So, figuring out how to put the paragraph together can sometimes feel like this huge challenge, right? When we really get into this nitty-gritty of paragraph structures, topic sentences, it can be a little daunting. The best advice I will ever be able to give you is to, as this last slide here says, is to read through your whole paragraph. I definitely recommend reading it out loud. If dogs were able to get degrees, my dog would deserve an honorary bachelor's in history because he has heard every paper I've ever written. And I know that's ridiculous, but the point is I read them out loud because sometimes when we say things in our head, we accidentally fill in blanks that we might not have put to paper or screen in this case, and that we assume that the reader's going to know, or we assume the reader's going to read it in such a tone. And so reading it out loud not only will save you from silly mistakes like missing a comma or putting, the wrong capitalization, who knows, the little simple stuff. And it also allows you to really feel that flow. When I know a lot of us have gotten papers back with feedback that say the flow here is weird, the flow is choppy, and that's like what's the flow? The flow is how it reads, and often we can only as the writers and the authors of our papers, we can only really sense that if we read it out loud or if someone else reads it for us. So for those of you that I've given that advice of flow, that's my number one suggestion. Read it out loud, or have someone read it out loud to you. And then you can go, oh, wait, that does sound weird. Actually, when you're saying it, you should pause right here. And sometimes that means there should be a comma or a period or a new idea. And then the seventh step, know when to start a new paragraph. Often it's hard for us to know when to stop, right? Because technically everything we're writing in that essay has to do with that thesis. But we need to be able to find a way to kind of learn where to stop. And so some of the bits of advice I have for that are for knowing when to start a new paragraph. Did I put a slide for that? No, I didn't. As soon as you address a new idea, argument, or issue, you should start a new paragraph. To determine if your paragraph is complete, ask yourself the following questions. Do all sentences relate to the topic sentence? So if you start reading and then you're at that second or third read through of your paragraph and you go, well, maybe this, I suddenly start talking about Sledge's experiences at boot camp. Well, that really doesn't have anything to do directly in this paragraph with his experiences in combat. So maybe those should be separated. Does each sentence make logical sense in relation to the one before it? Often this is where we also get that the critique of choppy flow when we feel like the topics go from one to another really quick, and we have readers whiplash trying to keep up with what's going on. Have you included enough evidence or examples to demonstrate your point? If you're writing a paragraph and you have some idea in there that doesn't feel well supported enough, but you're already at a point where your paragraph is 5, 6, 7 sentences long, might be a good idea to split it up and sometimes make that point a second time in a different way. Is it clear what each piece of evidence means and why you have included it? Right. Particularly, I know a lot of the rough drafts that I've received so far for essay number 2 have had upwards of 20, 25 references. And we have to keep in mind that the requirement was only 10. You're not going to get penalized for having too many, but you might get penalized if you have too many that you don't elaborate on well enough. I would always rather recommend someone hit that minimum of 10, but with 10 very well elaborated points instead of 20 poorly elaborated points. That's something that will lose you points. You will have technically met that requirement of 10 references or citations, but if you don't elaborate on them well enough, that's where you can hurt yourself on the points side of things. And then finally, the last question you ask yourself when thinking about whether or not this should be separated into a new paragraph: does all the evidence fit together and tell a coherent story? For the most part, each paragraph should be able to stand on its own as some example, right? Because I know we all dream of being professional historians, and one day we'll be the ones cited in other kids' papers. And so they have to be able to just take one block from our paragraphs and be able to use them for their own work. Now, like I said, it's important to consider to not think of paragraphs as isolated units. They are part of your larger argument that should flow organically from one point to the next. Before you start a new paragraph, consider that you will transition between ideas.
Can you say that last part again, please?
Of course. Don't think of paragraphs as isolated units, right? I know that in today's workshop particularly, we're looking at paragraph structure as a single thing, and I want you to look at each paragraph in and by themselves. But remember that they're not by themselves in your essay. In your essay, they're part of the whole story you're telling. They're part of that larger argument in the essay number 2's case, that Sledge's accounts of World War II complicate the idea of a good war. So each paragraph should say that, and they should say that based on the ideas you set forth through your thesis. And so that those ideas from paragraph to paragraph should flow organically from one point to the next. And before you start a new paragraph, consider how you're going to transition between those. Is that a little better? Or am I too wordy? Because I'm always too wordy.
No, that helped. Wordy's
Perfect.
not wordy enough.
All right. Oh, there's some stuff in the chat. It doesn't tell me. Oh, that was perfect. Thank you, Carlos. All right. Oh, he said he will doc if you go over 10 citations. Okay, well, that's good to know then. That's a very important point to know. That I haven't been in the last couple of courses because I've been busy putting these workshops together. But yeah, if he's okay, then the professor specifically said don't go over 10. then don't go over 10. For our purposes, anything the professor says is definitely going to be what matters. Okay, I think I'm going to end the recording now. In theory.